Russia. My name is Nastasia Panova. I'm a research assistant in the lab and the moderator of today's session. Today is the sixth lecture in the series of 13 entitled The Verb in East Caucasian. It will be given by Professor Timur Maisak. But as usual, before introducing our speaker, I will clarify some organizational issues. Each lecture will be recorded, live streamed on YouTube, and stored there afterwards. The lectures will go uninterrupted, followed by a question period. Those of you who are joining us via Zoom will be muted throughout the session in the interest of the lecture and sound quality. You may send your questions via the Zoom chat or YouTube live chat. At the end of the talk, I will share my screen with a full list of questions for the speaker to answer them. We apologize in advance that there might be not enough time to address all the questions, but Timur will be able to read them after the talk and hopefully find a way to answer you. So it's my pleasure to introduce Timur Maisak, a leading research fellow in the Linguistic Convergence Lab, associate professor of the School of Linguistics in the HSE University, and a senior researcher in the Department of Caucasian Languages of the Institute of Linguistics, Russian Academy of Sciences. Timur's research interests include linguistic typology, language context, historical linguistics, lexical typology, language documentation, and of course, the grammar of non-Dagestanian languages. He has performed extensive fieldwork on a number of under-described non-Dagestanian languages, such as Agul, Udi, Andi, Rutul, and has authored many publications devoted to tense and aspect systems of these languages. Timur is also an expert in the typology and grammaticalization of verbal categories. His articles have been published in such high-profile journals as Linguistics, Studies in Language, Diachronica, International Journal of Bilingualism, and Folio Linguistica. Timur is an editorial board member of the book series Languages of the Caucasus, published by Language Science Press, and the book series Languages of the Caucasus, and the journal Languages of the Caucasus. He also co-edited several books, including a book on the semantics of verbal categories in non-Dagestanian languages, published by Brill in 2018. Today, Timur will give us an overview lecture on the verb in East Caucasian. Timur, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Nastya, and hello, everyone. You can probably see now my screen, right?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So let us start. Those of you who have listened to the talk by Misha Daniel 2 weeks ago, but probably also many of you who haven't listened to that talk, are aware of the fact that East Caucasian languages are well known for the richness of their nominal inflection, especially as concerns locative case forms. There are different views on how to count these forms, more enthusiastic ones and more skeptical ones, but still this is a well-known fact. Recently, I came across the following statement in a general introduction to the languages of the world. The authors write that as opposed to the West Caucasian languages, the morphology of East Caucasian languages is very simple. The verb morphology of East Caucasian languages is very simple, whereas their noun morphology is very complex. Well, is verbal morphology of East Caucasian languages really so simple? I'm not sure this is so. Of course, if we compare average East Caucasian verb forms with the verb forms of Kartvelian or West Caucasian languages, the answer may be probably yes. We can look at these verbs in Georgian and Abkhaz. These verb forms alone can express such meanings as he or she would make you write it, or I shall make you speak with him about it for her. Of course, in East Caucasian, there is no such kind of complexity. These languages are not so heavily head marking. There are no so long morphological templates with many, many prefixes and suffixes. But in general, I think the answer should be negative. I don't think that verb morphology in East Caucasian is really very poor and simple. Of course, we do find very simple morphological structures of verbs in these languages. Let me illustrate this with two examples from two languages. We can see that in Bagvalal, which is an Andic language, the aorist, the perfective past, is simply identical to the verb stem or to the perfective verb stem. So hetli is a stem, and it is also the aorist form, said. And the second form, stopped, biri, is only slightly more complex because it includes gender agreement prefix. Another simple example comes from Udi, which is a Lesgic language. We see here the perfect form, which is just a suffixal form, the stem tats and the suffix e. Here in the form tatsene, the verb hosts subject agreement clitic, but in general, subject agreement doesn't have to be hosted by the verb. So the verb can be alone, like in this example, and subject agreement clitics can be hosted by something else, for example, by negation markers. Yes, let me clarify that in the examples which I cite, I have made the language name bold. I also indicate the branch of the family in brackets, and before the language name, I usually mention the name of a dialect. So Kvanada dialect of Bagvalal, the Nich dialect of Udi, and so on, just for your interest. Okay, so of course, there are very simple morphological structures of verbs in Nakh-Dagestanian or East Caucasian languages, but there are, of course, much more complex structures, which you can see here. For example, this form from Itsari Dargwa has both gender agreement and person agreement. And also the verb stem is quite complex. The root is C, yes, but this stem also includes a locative prefix or preverb onto and a gender agreement slot. Another example, which doesn't look very simple, comes from Agul. So the form akayefeichi, a polymorphemic form, that means if he or she does. This is the conditional mood form. In fact, this is a morphologized periphrastic form, and its structure is quite simple. So akafeichi consists of the participle akayev and the auxiliary verb, the conditional copula eichi. And this participle akayev is itself periphrastic. It consists of the imperfective converb and the auxiliary verb in the participial form, the auxiliary verb be in ayev. So there are comparatively complex structures in East Caucasian verbs. But when we speak about morphology, we don't only speak about morphological complexity of verb forms, but also about the richness of paradigms. For example, when they say that case systems of East Caucasian languages are exceptionally rich, we mean that there are many forms. The inventory is very big. For example, there are 48 cases in Tabasaran, 126 cases or case combinations in Says, and so on. Are East Caucasian verbs poor in this respect? No, of course not. Look at Archie, for example. Alexander Kibrik, in the famous 1977 grammar, writes that more than 1.5 million of inflectional forms can be derived from a single verb root in Archie. Here is his original table. Of course, Kibrik includes here both synthetic and periphrastic forms, all gender green forms, all case number forms of nominalizations, and also combinations with the quotative marker. But even if we exclude these gender number case distinctions, the number of forms in the paradigm is quite impressive. 47 synthetic forms, 233 finite forms, and more than 1,700 forms in total. So I hope I have managed to show you that the verb in East Caucasian languages is not as simple as it might seem. And in the rest of the talk, I will try to tell you more about the following topics. We will look at the structure of verbal lexemes. We will look at the morphological means employed in inflection. We will briefly look at how agreement categories are marked in the verb. Also, we shall discuss periphrastic or analytic forms and negation strategies. I'm not sure we will have time to discuss anything else, but the plan was also to show you some typical examples of indicative, non-indicative, and non-finite forms, but we'll see. So let us start with the verbal lexicon. An important distinction which is usually made is that between simple or simplex and complex verbs. Well, simplex verbs or simplex verb stems in the narrow sense are morphologically unanalyzable stems. But there are also stems that include derivational prefixes or suffixes. You can consider such stems to be intermediate between simplex and complex verbs, or if we want to keep this binary distinction, we can think of prefixal and suffixal stems as a subtype of simple verbs, because the crucial differences between simple and complex verbs is that simple verbs are one word and complex verbs are two words. Let me give you a brief example from Nij Udi. In Udi, there is only a restricted set of simplex verb stems, just a few dozens, maybe about 50. These are verbs like do, see, look, sit down, and so on. You see some examples here. In some verbs, this is also a very restricted number of verbs, you can identify historical prefixes, locative prefixes. For example, there are verbs with the initial la, like go up, put on. Here we probably have the preverb, the locative prefix super, on. There are verbs like buy, bop, enter, or pour into with a historical prefix ba, inside, and so on. There are also suffix stems. For example, there is just a handful of verbs with the suffix evk, which is a kind of a causativizer, not productive in the modern language. But for example, the verb artsevk, to make sit, is derived from the simple stem arts, sit down. But the overwhelming majority of the Udi verbal lexicon are complex verbs. These are verbs like, well, to grow or become big, which literally means big, become. To break transitive literally consists of the two parts, broken, do. To write literally is writing, say, and so on. So let us look closer at these types in different languages. Let us start with spatial or locative prefixes, or preverbs, as they are often called. Special prefixes do not exist in all East Caucasian languages, but they are quite prominent in some branches. In Lesgik, Dargwa, Nah, Hinaluk, there can be up to 3 spatial preverbs in the verb stem, and in some sense, the structure of this prefixal part is parallel to what we see in nominal morphology, in special case forms. There are special series of prefixes expressing localization and direction. Sometimes also deixis or elevation can be marked. So let me show you an example from Sanji Dargwan. So in this verb form, which means fell from, for example, from the horse, there is a prefix chir, which consists of 2 parts. Chi is super, on, and r is ablative, from the upper surface. And there is another prefix, ka, which means down. So literally, this combination means to go or to come down from the upper surface. And here is the full inventory of Sanji Dargwa preverbs. So you can see here the first group, the location, direction preverbs. Here, such locations are distinguished as on, under, in front of, inside, behind, out, and into. And each of these prefixes can have one of the 3 forms. They can be lative, expressing direction to, ablative, expressing direction from. That's what we saw on the previous slide. And essive, the absence of motion. And another slot can be occupied by one of the following prefixes, which express deixis or elevation, up, down, to the speaker or from the speaker. So the system is quite rich. Not only the structure of the special preverbs is similar to the structure of spatial cases in East Caucasian, but sometimes the morphemes themselves are cognate, especially those that mark localization. Sometimes the preverbs can also be cognate with special postpositions. This is especially well and can be especially clearly seen in case of a situation which can be called prefix case concord. Let me show what I mean here with an example from Tabasaran. So in the first sentence, she put it under her arms. You can see that the verb put includes a locative preverb. The localization is sub, under, and the noun phrase under arms is also marked with the localization sub, and the marker is historically the same, ku and ka. In the second example, you also have you also see the same localization, having taken it from under his neck. But here you can see that whereas the localization prefix is clearly cognate to the localization suffix on the noun, the direction markers are different. They are not cognate. Unfortunately, the distinction between simplex stems and prefixal stems is often like a continuum, because prefixal verbs can develop idiomatic meanings. The original locative component may be no longer evident, so one may wonder whether a given verb includes a prefix historically or not. And also, prefixes can become lexicalized, and they can just turn into phonological material of the root without any meaning. Let us look at this example from Agul. In the first example, you have a very transparent case. The girl put a scarf on her back. The verb to put includes a locative prefix. The localization is post, behind. So literally, this stem means put behind. And the root ich, meaning put, is a root that can combine with very many preverbs. Also, we see the same localization post on the noun, literally behind the neck. Okay. However, in example 2, we see another verb, to believe, the verb with an abstract meaning. The verb stem is kuch, so the first consonant k does resemble the localization post, but there are no other derivatives from this root. However, we can see that the argument of this verb, we believe in Allah. Here, yes, in Allah, is encoded with the post-essive case. So this suggests that probably this abstract verb believe does include the post-prefix historically, because otherwise the choice of the case form of the argument is not explicable. Let us look at another case, which can be an illustration of the final stage of lexicalization. In some dialects of Agul, there is a verb to look, which looks like khadurf or khuturf, and it seems to include the preverb of the same localization post, behind, especially given the fact that the object of looking, look at, is also encoded by the post-essive case. Okay, so everything matches here. However, in at least in one of the Agul dialects, in the Hupuk dialect, the verb to look looks like khuturf. So we don't see kh here, but kh, and the object of looking is encoded by the dative. You can see here the example, khuturfu me uchint ubalis. So he me looked at his ring, ubalis. So neither in the verb stem, we don't see this post preverb kh, because it changed to kh, nor in the argument encoding do we see the post-essive case. Although, of course, the verb khuturf is the same verb as khadurf and khuturf in the other Agul dialects. So here we see that the historical preverbal structure was completely lost. The verb changed both phonologically and syntactically. Okay, I think many of you might wonder whether prefixation in East Caucasian is used with any aspectual function, because we know that in Slavic and in some Caucasian languages, including Ossetic and Kartvelian, preverbs have perfectivizing function. No, nothing like that is observed in East Caucasian. Preverbs are not perfectivizing devices. There is only one exception. Tabasaran does employ two prefixes to derive perfective stems for those verbs which don't have prefixes. For example, the aorist from the verb up, to do, which doesn't have a prefix, will be rapnu. The prefix r is used here to form a perfective stem. There is, however, an interesting aspectual prefix, a prefix encoding a meaning from the aspectual domain, which is repetitive. It is found in Lesgian, Southern Agul dialects, and Rutul. This prefix looks like ch or ch. It seems to go back to the localization post, behind. And as Martin Haspelmath writes in his Lesgian grammar, this repetitive derivation is so regular that it could even be considered an inflectional category of the verb. Repetitive verbs can be derived from any verbal lexeme. You can see some examples here. Say again from say, go away or go back from go, and so on. There are some interesting idiomatic derivations. For example, in all the three languages, the repetitive verb become also means not only, it doesn't only mean become again, but it also means get better, recover, and the repetitive derivation of do means cure and repair. Okay, that was all for now about prefixes. Suffixation is also used as a derivational device in East Caucasian, mostly to derive causatives. Suffixal causatives are very common, although they are not universal to East Caucasian, but they are quite common, at least in some branches. There are suffixal decausatives in just a few languages, and there are also derivatives described as iteratives, de-telicizers, or antipassives in a number of languages, especially in the Avar, Andic, and Cesic. So let me give you just one example here from Beshta, a Cesic language with a very rich inventory of suffixal derivations. In Beshta, you can derive by means of suffixes so-called accidental or potential verbs, for example, to be able to cook or cook accidentally from to cook. Another type of potential verbs, to be able to put from to put. There is an antipassive or iterative derivation, for example, to eat iteratively from to eat. And there is also a causative, which can be single L or double L, and sometimes this corresponds to the distinction between single and double causative, like in this example. To show is derived from to see, and to cause to show is derived by means of this double L. But as far as I know, it is not always the case that double L expresses double causative. However, suffixal derivation is not typical of all the languages, and if you look, for example, at Agul, you won't find any suffixal verbal derivatives at all. Even causative is not derived suffixally in Agul because syntactic construction is used with the verb to do. Okay, Let us now look at complex verbs, or light verb constructions, or phrasal verbs, as they are sometimes called. These verbs consist of two parts, a lexical part, or co-verb, and a light verb. The lexical component can be a noun, an adjective, an adverb, an idiophone, and sometimes this is a bound stem, which doesn't occur outside of complex verbs. Borrowed verb stems can also occur as lexical components of complex verbs. And the light verbs are usually high-frequency verbs with generalized meanings like become, do, give, say, and sometimes other verbs. In principle, canonically, it is light verbs that host all inflectional marking. Here you can see some examples of complex verbs from Chechen. So you can see the original or the literal meaning of these combinations. So to write is write, do. Write is a bound stem borrowed from Turkic. To make an order is order, do. The noun is also a borrowing. To think is literally idea, do. To intend is idea, become, and so on. So this is how typical complex verbs in East Caucasian look like. And in some languages, especially in Lesgic languages, complex verbs are the only means of expanding verbal vocabulary. You cannot simply, for example, if you borrow a verb, you cannot simply inflect this borrowed stem. You have to use the light verb construction. And there are borrowings. In the case of Lesgic languages, they are usually from Russian or Azeri. You can see here two examples from Agul. So to organize will be organizovat akas. The lexical part comes from the Russian organizovat, the infinitive. The light verb is do. To live is yashamish has. Yashamish is an Azeri borrowing, meaning to live. The light verb is the agul verb, to become. There are dozens of verbs like that. It is important to understand that complex verbs are not a uniform class. Some of these verbs are close just to free syntactic combinations, but some of these verbs can be lexicalized and can be similar to simplex verb stems. So let us look at such examples. What I mean by free syntactic combinations, I mean that in transitive complex verbs with a transitive light verb do, the lexical part, the co-verb, typically occupies the position of an object noun phrase. Okay, so you can see here example one from Agul. The verb of the predicate to help is literally do help, help do. So example one, you help me, literally says you do help to me. Okay, so here we have an agent in the ergative, and the word help, kumek, is a direct object. Yes, is a patient in the absolute case. However, this is not always the case. There are verbs like kat, akas, which means to cut or to detach. It consists always, also of two parts. Kat is piece, which is also a noun. Originally, do is to do. But we can see here in example 2 that this lexical part, kat, is in fact a kind of incorporated element of the complex verb. And it is not an object. There can be another object, which you can see in example 2. So the girl cut off her long hair. will be, the verb will be kat kune, which simply means cut off, and the direct object, the patient, is yerhech arar, long hair. So there are different, so this is a more advanced stage, I would say, of lexicalization and of incorporation of the lexical part. Okay. We can also look at complex verbs and simplex verbs as a continuum, because complex verbs tend to become simplex verbs. This is a very common process, of course. And here I will give two examples of what can happen with complex verbs. The first example from Lesgian deals with the disappearance of the light verb. In Lesgian, as in most languages of the family, there are complex verbs with the light verb do. For example, to work will be kualach avun, work, do. And the full form, for example, the full form of the aorist, worked, can look as kualach avuna, literally work, did, with the full form of the light verb avuna. However, there can be also reduced forms, reduced tense aspect forms, in which the light verb is simply absent. Kualachna is also worked, but we don't see any light verb here. So this verb form, kualachna, looks just like a verb form of a simple verb. Another phenomenon can be observed in agul with some complex verbs. Here, the whole complex coverb plus light verb can serve as an input to derivational processes. What do I mean here? Let us look at the verb to call, unakas, which literally means sound do. Originally, this is a combination sound do. Okay, so if we want to make a repetitive from this verb, we can do it in the following way. We can make the repetitive form of the light verb, which will be kakas, yes, to call again, or sound do again. This is a normal way of derivation, because usually, as I already mentioned, all the morphosyntactic marking is on the light verb. However, for this verb and for a few other verbs in agul, another possibility exists. We can also make the repetitive derivation by placing the repetitive prefix before the whole verb, before the lexical part. Ka unakas, yes? So we can say that here the repetitive prefix is placed before the historical noun. But that probably means that unakas was reanalyzed just like a simple verb stem. So we can derive forms directly from this stem unak and not from the light verb. Okay, I hope this is clear. But well, complex verbs can become simplex verbs. That's not so surprising. Is the development in the opposite direction possible? I think that in some sense it is possible, and this is what happened in UD. Because in UD, simplex verbs were reanalyzed as bipartite, probably by analogy with the historically bipartite complex verbs. As I already mentioned, in UD, the overwhelming majority of the verbs are complex. And many light verbs have the monoconsonantal structure. For example, b is do, p is say, d is a causativizing light verb, s is the decausativizing light verb. And so it is probably by association with these monoconsonantal light verbs that the last consonants of simplex verbs came to be separable, came to be detachable, which led to the rise of endoclisis. Endoclitics are clitics that occur inside words. In particular, subject agreement markers in UD are endoclitics. And you can see here in the first example that they can occur between the parts of complex verbs. Eshnepsa, the verb here is eshb, which consists of two parts, work and do. So esh is work, b is do. So here the subject agreement marker is just placed between these two parts, which is not something very strange. However, what is strange is shown in example 2. Here we have a form of the verb to look. This is a simplex verb with a stem ber. But here we see that he or she looks will be bernechsa. So here the same third singular subject agreement marker is placed inside a simple verb stem, and it separates the last consonant from the rest. By themselves, neither the first part, ber, nor the second part, r, mean anything. They only mean something as a whole, ber, which means to look. Unlike in the first example, where both components of this complex verb have their own meaning. The situation is described in much detail in a book by Alice Harris. And I think this might be called a situation when simplex verbs are reanalyzed as complex verbs, as bipartite verb stems. Okay, so let me now briefly summarize the morphological means that are used in inflection. Of course, suffixes are used very often, and you have already seen many examples with suffixal forms. The prefixes are also used in inflection. I don't talk here about derivational prefixes, about locative preverbs. Gender markers can be prefixal. Negation markers can be prefixal. There are also some aspectual prefixes, like these perfective prefixes in Tabasaran, or the repetitives, which I already mentioned. And fixation is more rare, but gender markers can be infixal, and sometimes aspectual markers can be also infixal, especially the imperfective marker. Clitics, of course, can be used as grammatical markers associated with the verb. Person agreement markers are often enclitics. Auxiliaries, especially copulous, tend to cliticize to the main verbs. There are also clitics among modal and evidential markers, for example, reportatives, evidential markers with the meaning like they say, tend to be clitics. Negation is also expressed with clitics in some languages. Now, an interesting morphological means used in inflection in some languages is vowel alternations. I will give you an example of the plural marking by means of vowel alternations in a few minutes. And here I show you that vowel alternation is used as one of the means, not the only one, but just one of several, to distinguish between perfective and imperfective stems in some Dargwa languages, for example. So the perfective stem of the verb siu is barh, the imperfective stem is burh. Only the vowel alternation morphologically distinguishes these two forms. Sometimes vowel alternation is also used to derive iterative stems, for example, in Chechen, which you can see here. Now, another interesting means that is sometimes employed is reduplication, partial stem reduplication, which is mostly associated with pluractionality, especially in Avar-Andic and Cesic languages. You can see here a few examples from Chamalal. So Huhuda, drinks every day, is derived from hudi, to drink. Wo'ida, he often comes here, is derived from come. Also, potatoes can fall one by one. Bread can be cut into many little pieces, and so on. Such range of meanings can be expressed by means of stem reduplication. A very unusual situation is found in some Dargwa languages where negation is marked by means of stem reduplication. This is not the only means of expressing negation, one of the means. For example, in the Tsari Dargwa, we can see a negative stem, bertert, derived from the affirmative stem bert by means of reduplication. Historically, there was also a prefix involved here, but synchronically, it looks just like the reduplication of the verb stem. Okay. A bit more about verb stems. So, in principle, synthetic verb forms in East Caucasian languages can be usually grouped according to the stem they are derived from. An important opposition is between perfective and imperfective stems, which is found in not in all the branches of the family, but in many of them. So perfective and imperfective stems can be morphologically distinguished in various ways. The markedness relation is not always clear. Sometimes it is clear that the imperfective stem is derived, but sometimes the relation seems to be equivalent. And of course, high-frequency verbs like go, come, say, and some others tend to have suppletive aspectual stems. So let us look here at some possibilities in 3 languages. So you can see here that the strategies are very diverse. For example, in Archi, the 2 stems of the verb to die, ka and kar, are distinguished by suffixes. The stems of the verb to wash are distinguished with infixes and suffixes. The stems of the verb to freeze are distinguished by means of infixation, suffixation, stem reduplication, and vowel alternation, and so on. In general, as you can see here, reduplication of a stem is mostly associated with the imperfective stem, yes, like in case of khir, in sahur, and also infixation is associated as well with the imperfective, which you see in ortzur, also in mahweb, ilts, irch. So the infixation of r and l is mostly associated with the imperfective stem. Okay, let us look now at how gender is marked in the verb. Of course, gender agreement is a huge topic, and you will have soon a special lecture on agreement in East Caucasian by Marina Chumakina. Here, I will only say a few things which are relevant to verbal morphology. On the whole, gender or class, as it is also called, is a hallmark of East Caucasian languages. They can be 3 or more genders. Gender distinctions are manifested through agreement on verbs, adjectives, demonstratives, and other targets. This is an ancient feature which is inherited from Proto-East Caucasian. Only in 3 Lesgian languages gender was lost, in Agul, Lesgian, and Udi. So, on the clause level, gender is controlled by the absolutive argument, and within the noun phrase, gender is controlled by the noun phrase head. If we speak about verbs, an important thing is that if verbs agree in a particular language, it is generally not predictable which of them happen to have an agreement slot and which don't have an agreement slot, and where exactly this gender agreement slot is located. So we can look here at some examples from Andi. So Andi is in some respects a typical language with respect to the gender slots in the verb stem. So there are some verbs, both vowel initial and consonant initial, that don't have gender agreeing slot at all. Verbs like archon, ihi, iton, and so on. Here the verbs are cited in the aorist form. There are very many verbs which have prefixal gender agreement slot. For example, the verb to be has a gender agreeing slot, and the aorist can look like vuko, yiko, biko, riko, and so on, depending on the subject. And only a few verbs have an inflexible slot. For example, the verb to start, which you can see here. Okay, so it is absolutely unpredictable which verbs do have a slot and which don't, and where the slot is located. However, if there is a gender slot in a verb, the verb agrees in any of its forms, irrespective of finiteness, the meaning of the verb form, and so on. But an interesting fact is that gender slots can be found not only in verb stems, but also in some verbal affixes. Maybe you remember that we have seen sanji dargwa preverbs, yes, and there were gender slots in these preverbs, but also some inflectional suffixes can have gender agreement slots. This is rather an exception, but still there are such inflectional suffixes. And you can sometimes find a situation when there are 2 agreement slots in one verb form, which are associated with different agreement controllers. Let me illustrate this with 2 examples from Andic languages. So the first example from Tindi shows us that there are 2 agreement slots in the participle form. A man who caught a wolf, the verb to catch, is a participle. The stem of this verb has a gender agreement prefix, and here it agrees in a canonical, here it agrees in a canonical way with its absolutive argument with wolf. Yes, b is the neuter gender marker agreeing with wolf. But the participle marker in this language also has a gender agreement slot, and this slot agrees with the head noun, with the noun phrase head, which is man. A man who caught a wolf, literally, well, something like wolf catching man. Okay, so here in one verb we have two gender agreement suffixes, one on the stem, one on the participle marker, and the values of the gender values in the slots are different. Another example comes from Bhagvalal, in which a perfective converb also has a gender agreement slot. And here you can see the situation which is very close to what we saw in Tindi. This verb also happens to have a gender prefix, and this gender prefix agrees in a canonical way with its absolutive, having taken the spoon. So he took the spoon, yes. The gender prefix in the stem agrees with the absolutive spoon in the neuter gender, but the suffixal gender slot, which is part of the converb marker, agrees with the subject, with the absolutive subject of the main clause. Having taken the spoon, he prepared to eat. So this suffixal marker agrees with he. Unfortunately, here in this particular sentence, the absolutive subject is not expressed, but it is this argument that controls agreement here. And it also controls agreement in the main clause, in the main verb. Literally, he moved to eat, having taken the spoon. Okay? Well, this may be very exotic, but of course you can have, sometimes you can have more than one agreement slot in the verb with the same value of gender. The situation was described by Alice Harris again as exuberant exponents or multiple exponents. So here is her example from Batsby, a Nach language. So the verb means you all are evidently tearing down, are destroying. Yes. Here's the verb, and you can see here that gender marker occurs 3 times. The gender marker is de. It agrees with the absolutive object, old house. But one may wonder why we have to repeat this gender marker 3 times in one and the same verb form. Well, the answer is that we don't actually repeat it, because these 3 gender markers are associated with 3 different morphemes. You can look here at the structure of this form. So the first gender marker, de, belongs to the verb stem. The verb destroy happens to have a gender prefix, like many other verbs in East Caucasian languages. The second de belongs to the transitivity marker, which should be d, but here it fuses with the present tense marker o, so it results in do. And the third marker, de, belongs to another grammatical morpheme, which is the present evidential marker, which in its turn goes back to the auxiliary verb be. So there are 3 gender agreement slots, all agreeing with the same controller, but each of them belongs to its own morpheme, so to say. Okay. Let us now briefly look at number agreement in the verb. In principle, number agreement is often conflated with gender. So gender markers have different, usually or often, gender markers have different forms in the singular and in the plural. However, sometimes we can find in East Caucasian languages independent expression of number agreement, which is the case in Andi, for example, and here number can be marked by means of two different strategies. First, there are suffixal markers of the plural, which you can see here. So the prohibitive is one of the, not all the verb forms can agree in the plural, but the prohibitive is one of the forms which can. So don't be afraid in the singular and in the plural. You see here the plural marker ul. And it is, from its form, it is obvious that it is the same marker that is also found in attributive forms. For example, this and these. Ho, ul. You can see here the same marker ul as in the form sirdosubul, don't you all be afraid. Okay, so this is one way of marking plurality. And another way is by means of vowel alternations, which I already mentioned. This way is restricted to a small number of verbs with stem initial vowels. Agreement again is with the absolutive argument. And you can see a few examples here. She was in the singular will be yiko. They, women, were will be yoko. Yes, so e alternates with o in the plural. He was will be wuko. They, men, were will be woko. Again, e, the underlying e, which here looks like u, alternates with o in the plural. And in principle, both these strategies can be combined in one word. You can see here the prohibitive form. Wokedosubul, don't you all come here. So here we see the plural marking both in the verb stem and as a suffix to the whole verb form. Note that here gender markers don't change. We have in these particular genders in Andi, we don't, gender markers are the same in the singular and in the plural. So plurality is not expressed with gender markers, but only with these other means of expression. Okay, and I don't have to say, I don't have much to say about person agreement in the verb. Person agreement exists in some East Caucasian branches. This is definitely an innovation, not an inherited feature. And in all these languages that are mentioned here, person agreement systems are a bit different. But usually person agreement is marked by suffixes or enclitics. In some cases, person agreement markers are very similar to personal pronouns, which suggests their origin from personal pronouns. In general, person agreement markers are less tightly connected, less tightly integrated into the verb, which can be seen especially clearly in such languages as Lak and also Udi. But here we have an example from Lak, which shows that person agreement enclitics don't have to be hosted by the verb. They can be hosted by another constituent, by a focused constituent. You can see here in the first example, a sentence with sentence focus, and the person agreement marker is on the verb. But in the second example, the object noun phrase is focused. I'm building a house. And so the person agreement marker is on the noun phrase. Okay, let's go on. So far, you have only seen examples of synthetic verb forms, but of course, periphrastic verb forms or analytic verb forms also play an important role in East Caucasian. These forms consist of two parts, a non-finite component and an auxiliary. The auxiliary verb is postposed. In these languages, the most common non-finite components are participles, converbs, infinitives. The most common auxiliaries are copulous and existential verbs like be or be inside, which are usually morphologically deficient, but also a morphologically regular verb be, become, happen can be also used and is often used as an auxiliary. In principle, we can imagine a great number of potentially possible combinations of periphrastic forms, but of the components of periphrastic forms, but not all the potentially possible combinations are frequently used or even attested in natural speech at all. So the number of periphrastic forms is usually not that great. The number of forms that are commonly used is not that great. Here you can see some very simple examples of periphrastic forms. In the first example, the form is synthetic. This is the synthetic aorist, the synthetic perfective past in Sahur. In the second example, you see the periphrastic perfect, which is derived from the perfective converb, which is identical to the synthetic form, which is derived by means of the auxiliary verb, which is a copula, the present tense copula. So literally something like is opened, yes, or opened is. And in the third example, you can see the pluperfect, which is derived from the same lexical component by means of the auxiliary verb become in the aorist form, literally was opened. Okay, the system is very similar to what we see in English, for example, although it is not the verb to have that is used, but the verb to become and the copula. Okay. Of course, as it usually happens with periphrastic forms, there is a gradual drift towards synthetic forms, especially when the former auxiliary becomes cliticized and then affixed to the matrix, to the main verb. You can see this process very clearly in Agul, in which, in principle, all the core indicative tense and aspect forms are originally periphrastic. However, in the modern language, they mostly appear as highly morphologized because the main verb fuses with the auxiliary. You can see here some examples. The aorist is originally a combination of the perfective converb and the present copula. So ruchunia, which is the aorist, is originally ruchuna e. However, it doesn't occur in this bipartite form anymore. It only occurs in the synthetic form ruchunia. The perfect is the combination of the perfective converb, and another auxiliary verb, be inside, in the present tense. And although this complex form like ruhuna a still exists and still can be used, it is much more often, the perfect occurs much more often in a fused form like ruhuna or ruhunaya. And the same is true of the present tense, which is a combination of the imperfective converb and the same auxiliary verb, be inside. Literally something like reading is inside, or is inside reading. Yes, this complex structure, ruhai a, again, is in principle also possible, but usually the present has the synthetic form ruha or ruhai. Okay. In most languages, in most East Caucasian languages, tense and aspect systems include both synthetic forms and periphrastic forms. But there is high variation among the languages of the family as to the balance between them. Some languages prefer synthetic forms, some languages have many periphrastic forms. For example, if we talk about agul, we can say that, well, at least historically, all or most of the core indicative forms are synthetic. And Andi language belongs to this synthesis, say, languages, because in Andi, all the core tense and aspect system is synthetic. There are no periphrastic forms with the present copula. Probably the reason for this is that the copula, which is E or G, well, is not used in typical copular clauses like I am a teacher. Yes, such clauses don't have any copula at all. And this element E or G usually occurs in locative and possessive clauses like I have a car, or there is, I don't know, there is something somewhere, okay? So you can see here the Rikvani Andi indicative system on the left. You can see here only synthetic forms, okay? On the right, you can see the Bagwalal indicative system. Bagwalal is a closely related language. And you can see here that in Bagwalal, there's quite a few periphrastic forms with the present copula equa. For example, the perfect, the present, the prospective, and the intentional, and also the analytic. And also one of the two futures are all periphrastic and all include the copula as an auxiliary. And the copula equa in Bagwalal is a normal copula which occurs in normal non-verbal clauses like I am a teacher and so on. Okay. Another language which can be placed at the synthesis pole is Udi, as opposed to the other Lesgic languages, because in Udi, like in Andi, all the core tense and aspect system is synthetic. Yes, by the way, Andi and Udi are spoken at the opposite edges of the Dagestanian, of the East Caucasian speaking area. Andi is spoken on the north, close to the border with Chechnya. Udi is spoken in northern Azerbaijan. So these languages belong to different branches and are not very closely related. However, in UD, we also see that all the core indicative tenses are synthetic. And if we compare this language with any other, with the other East Caucasian languages, we will see that this is an exception. For example, if we look at Rutul indicative system, we will see that more or less like in Agul, all the indicative forms are periphrastic. They all consist of a non-finite component and a copula or an auxiliary verb be inside. Okay, so we don't have much time left, but okay, I think I'll try to cover briefly one more topic, which is negation strategies. Let me at least name them, how negation can be expressed in East Caucasian languages. It can be expressed with suffixes and prefixes, which is not very interesting, maybe. But here you can have, here you can see some examples. Negative suffixes in avoir, negative prefixes in dargois. Okay. I can skip this. Negation can be also expressed with clitics, at least negative markers in such languages as Udi and Ingush can be described as clitics. You can see that in Udi it is the negative marker that hosts subject agreement. Clitics, as I already mentioned. And in this Ingush example, you see that the negative proclitic can also host other clitics. In this case, it hosts the additive marker or coordinating marker. So literally, this is something speech not even doing, not even saying a word. Okay. There is an interesting negation strategy in Lesgian where, in principle, there exists a negative prefix, like in the other Lesgic languages. However, only a closed set of verbs can take prefixal negation, and most verbs use the combination of a special periphrasis form of a lexical verb and a negative auxiliary, a negative form of the auxiliary verb of dummy verb do. Okay, you see here that whereas such verbs as give or go do have prefixal negation, such verbs as fall silent or eat cannot take prefixal negation. They have to derive negative forms by means of this periphrastic construction with the dummy verb do. Okay. Well, of course, in periphrastic forms, which we have just discussed, it is normally the auxiliary that takes the negative form. For example, you can see here the present habitual in agul, which, well, literally doing is, yes, is doing. In the negative, the auxiliary occurs in the negative form. Is not doing, like in English, so to say, okay? However, the situation is more interesting because in Agul, like in many other East Caucasian languages, non-finite forms can be also negated by means of prefixation. And we can have negative converbs as well. And converbs are parts of these periphrastic forms. So the question is, can we have negative forms of lexical verbs within periphrastic forms? And the answer is positive, yes. in periphrastic forms, we can have, at least in agul, we can have negation on the lexical verb as well. So these forms are combinations of a negative converb. In this case, yes, in case of the present habitual. So daruchaye, for example, is a combination of the negative converb daruchai and the affirmative auxiliary e. But the meaning of this form is slightly different. It is not just does not read, as here with the negative auxiliary. The meaning of this form is rather, well, he does something, but what he does is not reading. He does something else, but it's not reading what that he does, okay? And we even can have two negations, yes, in one verb form. This happens when we use a negative lexical part, for example, a negative converb and a negative auxiliary. So the last example here, daruchai deva, literally not reading isn't. And the resulting meaning is something like, it's not that he or she doesn't read. For example, you say that someone doesn't read. No, it's not that she doesn't read, she doesn't do something else, but it's not true that she doesn't read. Such combinations are also possible. So, as you might have noticed from these examples, there are usually more than one negation marker or negation strategy in East Caucasian languages, and the split may occur between synthetic and periphrastic forms, between finite and non-finite forms, between different tense aspect forms, or between, so to say, strong and weak verbs, which we see in Lesbian. And prohibitives, if we take non-indicative forms, prohibitive usually and maybe even always have a distinct negation marker and are usually not derived from imperatives. Okay, I'm afraid I have to stop here. Fortunately, we have many more lectures to come, and in many of them, verbs will be discussed in one or another way. So we will learn much more about verbs in East Caucasian in subsequent lectures. And that's all for today. Thank you, and stay safe.
Thank you very much for your talk. Now I will share my screen so that everyone can see the questions. A moment. Okay, so we start with questions from Tatiana Filipova.
I see the order. Yes, it's, I see. The direction marker is closer to the root, but you can look at it in another way. You can say that the whole complex, localization plus direction, has the same order as in nominal forms. So there is a complex, localization plus direction, and we have the same complex of morphemes in nominal forms and the same complex of morphemes in verbal forms. Maybe the reason for this particular order is that the these spatial preverbs were grammaticalized not separately localization proverbs separately and direction proverbs separately, but as already complexes of morphemes, so we can hypothesize that, for example, well, the combination of superlative, grammaticalized, morphologized, or fused with the verb already as a complex of morphemes, as an adverb, for example, which already has two morphemes, super and elative. Okay, I hope that answer this question. So I don't see an asymmetry here. About borrowing from Turkic, I don't really know. Maybe, but maybe not. I mean, complex verb constructions are, well, very simple patterns, so I don't think they can appear only under context influence, but this is not excluded. Of course, it is clear that those languages which are in contact with Turkic and Iranian, in particular Lesgic languages, in general have more complex verb constructions than the other languages. So contact is probably involved here, but I'm not sure this is the only explanation. Yeah, I see. Well, in the Bagbalal example, butter is inside a purposive clause, if I understand you correctly. So the sentence literally says, he moved to eat butter. Yes, so butter is inside another clause, to eat butter. And there is no agreement in that clause because the verb to eat doesn't have a gender agreement slot. This is how I can answer briefly. Okay. Oh, Johanna answers to that question. Okay, yes, thank you, Johanna. Aigul's question, are there many bound roots that require preverbs? Well, the variation is great, and I cannot say. Well, in those languages that I know, there are both roots that can be used without preverbs and roots that are bound and cannot be used without preverbs. I'm not sure about the statistics because, well, I just don't know. It seems, I think that I have an impression from Aigul that there are more bound roots that require preverbs, and they can be combined with much more preverbs than those roots that can be used without preverbs. But this is just a general impression. Okay. Could you please?
Yes, we have several comments. Maybe you would like to...
I mean, you mean not answers, but just comments? Mm-hmm. Yes, great. Well, some people say that East Caucasian and West Caucasian are sisters.
Okay, then there is this discussion.
Yeah, I see, yes. It is eclectic because in some contexts, not in the verb, but in other contexts, it can be classified as eclectic. But when it occurs with the verb, when it occurs inside, the only thing we can say that here it is eclectic that occurs intramorphemically, okay? Maybe there can be other ways to describe this. For example, we can say that there are two sets of markers. One is eclectic and another one is an infix, but usually, and in Alice Harris's book, this is described like that. These elements are eclectics based on some criteria, but they also can occur inside verbs. Okay, any other?
Okay, there are some interesting
Oh, yes.
after, but well, I'm afraid our time is up. So maybe you could answer.
Okay, thank you for your comments.
Yes, I'd like to thank everyone for participating and for asking questions. We hope to see you again next week at the lecture on evidentiality by Samira Ferhez. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.